Greetings, traveler. Have you ever been in a situation where you're playing a video game and it's this kind of video game where you can gather a party and get many items for your character and there's builds in the game and so on. And no matter how much you try to optimize your character and make sure that your character in your party is effective, that always fails. You always end up with a subpar character and a subpar group, and no matter how you try to use your abilities, eventually it all leads to you dealing very low damage and being unable to deal with the game's adversaries. So today what I want to do is dive a little bit into this situation and how this happens and in what sort of game this kind of phenomenon can happen, how these suboptimal builds are created, and I want to show you my one extremely simple, extremely effective trick that has made me avoid this situation altogether. My name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for over 13 years now, and I've been playing video games ever since I can remember, actually. So it has happened to me so many times that I'm playing a game, I'm having fun, I'm receiving new characters for my party, usually an RPG or an action RPG or a strategy game, characters for my party, new members for my armies, and so on. And no matter how much I level them up and I make sure they have things relevant to what they should be doing, I always seem to end up in this situation where my party is full, everybody is chock full of items, every slot has something in there, my armies were full of units, everything seemed to be as it should be. But all of my parties and all of my armies and the characters were extremely ineffective. So I'm talking about the situation where the game asks you, do you want to add this character to your party or that one? Or do you want to make this character this class or that class? Or do you want more archers for your army or do you want more cavalry for your army? For your character, do you want to increase your hit points or do you want to increase your attack power? All of these options are good. None of these options is obviously catastrophically bad. And as we're playing a game, due to, not knowing everything about the game and due to playing fatigue and decision fatigue, also analysis paralysis, where whenever a new option comes to us, we just don't have the brain power to sit down and analyze every little detail of the game just to make every single decision. We want to just get it over with and move on. So this is the quicksand trap that slowly lures us in, and it's not obvious in the beginning because in the beginning of the most games it's pretty easy to get by no matter what choice you have. But soon you get into this point where your way of playing is just extremely ineffective, especially if you're playing in higher difficulties. You're not sure why, but your characters are just not doing damage, or the enemies seem to overwhelm you instantly, or you had in mind this build for a character, and even though you've made all the right choices, the character doesn't perform the primary task he's supposed to be able to perform. So it's a very strange, very weird situation to happen. And the way this happens is that the game is giving you all these choices, and because games don't generally give bad choices, there's no choice like reduce your hit points by half for no benefit, or like, remove a member from your party with no better alternative. All the choices are good, right? So whenever we make a choice, it feels good, it feels helpful. But unless these choices are made with a specific direction in mind, they one by one give us the death of a thousand cuts, and they just dilute whatever we're trying to achieve with our party, and they just lead us in a no man's land, essentially, where everything is there but it's just not working. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take a look at some popular game systems, and this list is by no means exhaustive. In fact, the elements I mention for each game are not exhaustive either. It's just a sample to show you how different games present difficulties to us and challenges, and how we can use this as a base to create a system so we can have a very simple question to help us optimize our characters, our parties, our armies, or whatever happens to be in the game. So let's jump in. Let's look at these systems first, and then we'll talk about how to take advantage of each system to build effective characters, parties, and armies. So let's jump in. First, let's look at Mass Effect. So whenever I play Mass Effect, usually I come up with these 5 types of difficulties. So some enemies have shields and you have to get past them to do damage to the enemies. Others might have armor, so you need to chew through the armor or find spaces in the armor where you can avoid it and you can shoot through it. Some enemies have very, very high speed, so you cannot physically target them because they just move so fast. Some might have biotics that prevent you from getting to them or attacking them and so on. And finally, there is swarms. So there's many small enemies, so even if you're good at taking out a single character, they just swarm you and they overwhelm you. So this is the way Mass Effect can present difficulties to us as players. And again, this is just the way I see it. It's completely normal if, for example, you have no problem with shields, but there is some other category down here that is giving you trouble. So feel free to customize this to whatever degree you like when you're thinking about the system. But generally, I found that 4 to 5 items that present difficulties to us per game are usually enough for the system to work. So let me quickly run through the rest. So in Dungeons & Dragons, typically we have enemies who are strong with constitution saves, or they have high hit points. Enemies that are strong with reflex saves, so it's difficult to get them with abilities that target reflex. Similar for will. Some of them have very, very strong single characters, so they might have lots of hit points or some gimmick that just makes them really, really hard to down quickly. Or they might have multiple characters in groups that, you know, even if you have let's say a super good sniper in the party that can take out any character, there's just too many enemies to take out quickly enough to be able to defeat the challenge altogether. So, and again, I know this is not the exhaustive list, but this is just a simple framework to give you the most common, let's say, challenges when you enter an encounter in a D&D type system. So for Total War, the big ones is large opponents, entities that count as large, such as cavalry, small opponents or entities that count as infantry, so human or so based. Then there is the cavalry itself, or flying cavalry, depending on the game. So this is a different category from the large because speed is the key here. So if the cavalry is faster than yours or your armies, then you simply cannot catch them and they can run circles around you. If they're flying, even worse, and you don't have anything for flying, then they can maybe pick the time and the place where they engage with you to get favorable engagements, and you might not be able to do anything about it. Single entities, of course, is a big thing in the game, so very strong lords, very strong monsters and so on often give the players trouble. And finally, archers and artillery are something difficult because even though they're quite weak in melee, usually the game finds ways to protect them well or to bog us down with infantry so they can do lots of damage to us. So that's it for Total War. In Final Fantasy type of games, usually you have enemies that have very high hit points, so they just take a long time to beat. Or they might have very high evasion. Again, the speed factor here makes it difficult to hit them. It feels like your character doesn't have enough accuracy to hit these enemies. Groups, same as before. Some of the enemies have magic shields, so even though your character might be strong otherwise, there is some sort of effect protecting the enemy, so you can't quite get to them. Maybe they have reduced damage when you attack them, or maybe they're completely invulnerable. Elemental damage might fall into this, so maybe you deal fire damage and the enemy absorbs fire damage. In this kind of system, this can happen very often. And finally, there's the debuffs, where your character didn't do anything wrong, your party didn't do anything wrong. It's just that there's some natural effects that happen in the enemy party, so your group gets all poisoned, or they're all blinded, or they're all slowed down. And even though normally you would be able to handle this challenge, now it's just bogging your party down so much that your whole group feels ineffective. So again, this is just one way of seeing this, and you might be categorizing this in a completely different way. Maybe here you just have ice elemental and fire elemental and wind elemental and so on. So this is completely normal, but just a few categories per game is all we need for this system. So when you're making a character, typically I find that if I just make choices in the game one by one, I will end up in this quicksand trap where my group will feel ineffective basically with maximum certainty. The way to avoid this, I have found, is whenever I create the main character of the game or pick the main lord of the game and so on, is to make that decision extremely consciously and with some use in mind. Let me explain. So for most of these games, let's say in the beginning of the game you choose a fighter character or an archer character or a magic caster character. You make this choice because it sounds cool in your mind and because you want to use their abilities. If you select a caster as your main character who can do fireballs, then there is the unspoken assumption that you probably want to use fireball a lot in your playthrough. You chose this character because you like his abilities, you like his strengths, you want to use them as much as possible. And that is deceptively the most important choice that you will make in the game, because any other choice that the game presents us with has less of an impact than the choice of the main character. Sure, if we make the main character purposely weak, then yes, other entities in the game will be stronger, but basically every game is designed in such a way that the main character or the main entity that you create or that you select to play the game with has the most power potential in the game. They can grow fastest in strength, they can gain the most abilities, they can equip the strongest items, and so on. Again, this is not 100% of the case, and in some games it's possible for other characters to become extremely overpowered. Yes, I know that exists, but in most games, by design, the main character has the most potential for growth in the game. And since we're going through the disclaimers here, let me add these two. So this method that I'm about to describe is probably not best done on your first run. At least that's how I do it. In my first run when I'm playing a game, even if I don't finish the first run, if I don't clear the game, I usually like to take it in a more lighthearted way and just see what the game has to offer, see what's happening in the game, what types of enemies exist in the game. So essentially my first run is devoted to finding out what general categories of adversaries exist in the game. If it's a game type that you're very familiar with, you can probably assemble this list much faster and start using this technique much faster. But anyway, the second disclaimer I want to make here is that this technique I'm going to describe is not for creating the absolute optimal build that's mathematically perfect and it's the one build to roll them all for now and forever. Personally, I'm not interested in these like mathematically perfect builds. What I am interested in this case, is avoiding very, very suboptimal builds. So builds that are so diluted, so all over the place that they hurt the enjoyment of the player during the game. So I know I always make a long intro for these things, but I think it's important to understand the context of this framework before we jump into it. So what is the framework? It's quite simply the question of, assuming you have created a character, what is that character good at? If he's a sniper, then he's probably good at single target, high damage abilities. If he's a fighter, perhaps he's good at lower damage, but very highly sustained with very high frequency. If it's a caster, perhaps he's good at crowd control or mass damage or very slow but very high damage abilities. Whatever it is, whatever you have in mind for this character to achieve, the strength of that character is very, very likely highly effective against one of these things, usually more than one, but at least one of these things. So let's take the example of a D&D like generic RPG kind of game, right? So let's say that you make archer sniper kind of character. The idea here is that he can do damage from ranged, he perhaps can do very high damage depending on the build and so on, but he's not very good with groups unless you build it so, and yeah, he's quite limited at that. So good at range, good at single target, not so good with groups or anything else. But when you're building this character, you know what you enjoy most about that. So is it that super high damage one-shot thing, or is it disabling a character from a distance? Whatever it is, there is one very specific thing that this character is good at. And I'm stressing this out so much because it dictates all of the other choices that you will make in the game in an extremely easy and helpful way. So let's stick with this example, although you can imagine how you could use the system if we were talking about a fighter instead or a caster instead and so on. So let's say that you made your archer character who is very, very good with single target attacks from distance. So is he going to have an issue against high constitution enemies? Not likely. He's designed to do high single target damage. Okay. What about reflex? Maybe the enemy is particularly evasive, but if the character's focus is hitting single targets, then that's probably not the case. Will, again, it's not likely that high will opponents are going to have much of a challenge against him. Single target, probably not. Multi enemy groups. This is likely what this character will have trouble with. So as long as he can keep his distance from the enemy, and as long as he can fight enemies one at a time, the way we build him is meant to deal with that, so he's going to be fine. He's not going to be fine if lots of enemies charge him all at once. So because of that, because we have this very, very clear strength in mind for this character, then we can start making every single choice for what items to get, what companions to get, and so on in the game. Let me explain. So let's cover this in 3 steps. First, the abilities for the character. Second, the items, and so on. And third, the companions or other members for the group. So for the abilities of the character, we ask this question. Every time we level up or we gain a new ability and the game asks us, do you want this one or this one? The only question in our mind is this going to make me better at what I do? So if single target damage is what I do, is this going to make me better at it? If that's the case, then that's a great ability. Take that choice. Happy days. If it's not, then can it help me avoid something I'm having trouble with? So perhaps some status the enemy is causing, or some quality of life thing I'm facing in the game, or some other situation that my character is not built for dealing with at the moment. Perhaps this is the multi-enemy combat we were talking about. Now, if it does help you avoid something you're not equipped to deal with, then perhaps that's a good choice to get. Although perhaps this is better dealt with a party member that's specialized in this kind of thing. But anyway, the simple way is, does it help your primary thing? Yes, get that. If it doesn't, does it at least help you avoid things you're not good at? If so, then that's a good choice too. Anything else you can easily avoid. If it's an ability that gives you +1 luck on Tuesday afternoons, who cares? Or if it's an ability that gives you, +10 hit points, depending on the game, that's insignificant. You can ignore it, you can get something else. Mind you, this is not a bad thing. Getting +10 hit points is not bad. It does not harm your character. But the opportunity cost here suggests that instead of getting something that could actually help your character, you're getting something that's kind of lukewarm, neither here nor there kind of ability. So that covers abilities on your main character. Let's move on to items. So for items, it is much the same deal, although items are slightly different, because items you can hopefully sell or exchange or transmogrify or break down into components, or all these things that games offer, or simply give to a different character. So for items, the same framework applies. Does it improve the main thing you're good at? Yes, equip it, happy days. No, does it help you avoid something you're bad at? This is pretty rare, but if it does, that's also good. Anything else, again, like +1 charisma when your character just doesn't care about charisma, pointless. Just don't worry about it. Give it to another character, sell it, transmogrify it, whatever. If you can choose the other option instead, if it applies as we mentioned. So that is basically how you can very, very easily make the decision about what to do with every single item. And finally, the big one is additional entities that come into your group. So new characters, if we're talking about an army style game, new units, new lords, all that kind of stuff. So when we're thinking about what companions to add to the party, and as it usually is the case, what class to give them or what build to give them and so on, then we ask exactly the same question. And here's a big trap for these suboptimal builds. When the game presents us with the option, somehow it's very misleading. When the game says, here's this big dude with a big axe for your party, do you want to make him a berserker, or do you want to make him let's say an archer mage sub-dual class kit multi thing? And we're thinking, yeah, that might be interesting. So even though if the question was phrased differently, we would have given a different answer, when the game asks in the way it does, and it just gives us the choice of 3 subclasses or 3 different builds for the character, that completely takes our mind away from the real question of, is this choice going to make my main character stronger? Yes? Okay, let's pick that. So maybe there's a choice for a character who can buff the main character. Or if that's not the case, can this character help us avoid something we're bad at? In the case of the archer, the sniper archer, can this character, this new addition to the party, for example, keep enemies from getting to our archer? So act like a bodyguard, for example. Or is it a mage who can cast mass damage spells or mass debuff spells to take care of the multi-entity enemies? So after, let's say, that new caster to the party casts a big fire spell and most of the weak enemies are dealt with, then the few that remain can be dealt with our main character archer. If that's the case, then that's also cool. We can get them. Any other choice? Any like, oh, this character can sing, or this character is good with throwing daggers. Throwing daggers is good, but in this case, we already have a character who is very, very good at long range, high damage, single target output. So unless this throwing dagger character can do something our main character can't, it's just taking away from the power of our character. And again, I know there's a case where no, even though it's the same type of character, he can still help us. If so, then I guess that's fine. But be very, very careful of this kind of choice, because it's very insidious, it's very sneaky. The game makes it appear in such a way that we think, oh yeah, I would love a character that throws daggers, even though we know that a character who would buff our main character for making and help him deal even more damage would be a way better option than this character who does whatever our main character does, but in a lukewarm, watered down kind of way. So there you have it. That's my super easy framework for, if not achieving the highest damage building games, it has definitely helped me avoid very, very weak combinations in games that creep up to us seemingly all the time without us consciously making any bad choices at all. So to wrap it all up, it's simply whenever a new choice, a new item, or a new companion or a new addition to the party is presented to us in the game, first we ask, does this improve my main character's strength? If yes, great addition, bring it on, let's rock. If it doesn't improve what our main character is doing, does it help our main character deal with situations he's bad at? So when our character gets hurt, for example, does this new character heal us so we can continue do what we do? Or does he take care of one of these situations that we're just bad at and our main character cannot deal with? Or can he buff our main character so that he does what he does like even better than before? Any of these cases, good. If it's neither of these two, if he doesn't improve our strengths or cover for our weaknesses, then we don't have to get that choice. We can get anything else. And of course, it's also the case that you cannot throw away a choice. Perhaps the game gives you an item that doesn't really offer much, but it's better than having nothing in a certain slot. And in that case, yeah, why not? But as soon as you have the opportunity to replace it with something that either helps your strengths or covers for your weaknesses, that's a good time to replace it, sell the item, change the party character, and so on. I know this sounds extremely obvious and extremely simple, but because of the way choices are presented in games, this is super easy to miss. I know I've made this mistake tons of times. So if this helps even one person out there get more enjoyment from their favorite characters and their favorite builds in games, I will be super happy. Anyway, thank you so much for your time. And as always, have fun.